This Saturday at noon Eastern Time, live on the Big Ten Network, we have all the way from the Pacific West Coast, the 4-3, 2-2 in Big Ten play Washington Huskies, taking the road to play in Memorial Stadium against Indiana, the 13th ranked Indiana Hoosiers, who are undefeated, 7-0 overall, 4-0 in Big Ten Conference play. The line opened up at Indiana -6.5, and it's stayed as steady as she goes. And Indiana is favored to win this game 83. They're given an 83.9% chance to win this game, according to ESPN's Football Power Index. This is a fascinating game with Indiana coming off of a massive win. Washington had a bye this past weekend, so they had some extra time to prepare for what is a huge game for Jedd Fisch and his Huskies. And with Curtis Rourke not playing in this game and Taven Jackson starting for Indiana, is there the potential for Washington to hang around and maybe come out with the win? Or will it be another Indiana blowout? Well, we're going to explore that here today on College Football with Sam. And before I give you my preview, prediction, and analysis, if you could subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, like the video, share the channel around to others who want more college football content, who need another college football channel to follow, and comment your prediction down below. Those things would help out the channel a lot, help us get more views, more subscribers. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers by really the end of the month, really as soon as possible, and we'll be doing a giveaway to celebrate that. So you will want to hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when that giveaway occurs. And all those things, again, liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting the bell, commenting, joining our Discord server via the link in the description or the link in the pinned comment. All of those things are free. They help the community. They help us to get more views, consequentially more income and watch hours, the things that help this channel out on YouTube. And we reinvest a lot of that back into College Football with Sam, the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, aspiring to be the best college football channel on YouTube. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can donate to the channel via the Patreon page, sign up as a monthly paid member, or you can purchase merchandise from my merchandise store. And I will tell you, this white t-shirt, I have multiple of them because this is what I want to wear on the show. It's very comfortable. Highly recommend you buy it, or any other merchandise and clothing we have on the store. And the link to that in the Patreon page is in the description and also in the pinned comment. But let's talk about this game. The last time these two teams played was when Washington was a member of the Pac-12 and Indiana was a member of, well, as they are today, the Big Ten, all the way back in 2003. I was either a year old if this was a bowl game, but I don't think it was a bowl game. I think this was a regular season game. I'm going to check that because I want to be accurate. I was not even a year old when this game occurred because I was born in 2002. That's when I was born. So interesting how a lot of these matchups that are going to be occurring on a semi-regular basis or a regular basis. Yeah, this was a regular season matchup in September 6th of 2003. I was not even a year old. Many of these matchups that we're going to be seeing more often and that feel still like non-conference games are actually conference games. Indiana and Washington, to me, already feels like mostly a conference game, but a large part of that is the fact that I've really only been passionate about college football in an in-depth way since 2020. So many of you who are older, or maybe who are my age, early 20s, but even in your teenage years you were really into football, this is a big change. I look forward to this type of big change, but I will not lie and say that there is a lot with the sport that I know we don't like for a variety of good reasons. Hopefully there are some, better guidelines, wiser rules, and things that come our way in the sport so that the greatest sport of America and of the world can stay the greatest sport ever. But in talking about this game, it's so interesting because Washington is more talented than Indiana via recruiting rankings. I think that most people, even perhaps myself included, though I don't remember if I I think I viewed Washington, yes, as better than Indiana. I'm pretty sure about that now that I remember, but not much better. Most people would have expected Washington to be in the place they are at right now, but they would have expected Indiana to incur a loss or two. Well, Indiana's undefeated, and they look like one of the best teams in the country, and Washington is where I think many people expected them to be, like hovering around 500 in the later part of October, struggling to get to a bowl game, but they could technically get to a bowl game if some things go their way. You look at power ratings, Indiana is viewed as 17.4 points better than the average college football team in FPI. And they are viewed as 18.8 points better than the average college football team in S&P+. They are top 15 in basically every power rating system. And this is a big and, they are top 10 in ESPN's efficiency metrics. They are top 5 in game control. They're also top 5 in the efficiency metrics. They're number 5 in overall efficiency. Their offense is first nationally in contribution to scoring margin on a per play basis. I just made sure I wanted to read the ESPN definition for their efficiency. It basically means Indiana's near the top of the country in points per play, and they are, which is mind-boggling. It's absolutely crazy. And then defensively, per ESPN's efficiency metric, they're 68th, so they're pretty they're pretty one-dimensional. Just have an average defense and an elite offense, and their special teams is all right. I think I and many of you are still processing how good Indiana is. But as I've said on Twitter, by the way, follow me on Twitter via the link in the pinned comment if you haven't already. As I've said, Indiana is a near elite to elite team. I still think the power ratings are underestimating them. Their strength of schedule is weak, yes, but they are dominating a weak strength of schedule like we've seen past Ohio State and past Michigan teams dominate a weak strength of schedule. I think it's time to recognize Indiana for who they are, one of the better teams in college football. Washington is viewed as 6.1 points better than the average college football team in FPI and 11.3 points better than the average college football team per S&P+. This is a noon game. I expect the stadium to be full and loud like it was against Nebraska, especially since college game day is there, I think, for the first time in Indiana's history as a football team. So let's give Indiana 3 points. Their stadium isn't big or loud enough to, I say, give them more than 3 points home field advantage. All in all, Indiana is expected to beat Washington by around 10.5 points, so 10 or 11 points per S&P+, and they are expected to beat Washington by 14 points or 2 touchdowns per FPI. So Indiana is viewed as the better team than Washington. You also have to remember this game's kicking off at 9 a.m. local time for Washington. They do have a bye, so they had a nice week of rest, but I imagine that travel time sort of cancels out any potential benefits of the bye week. These teams are, again, totally different when you look at points per play margin, which is really a measurement of dominance. Washington, by the slimmest of margins, has a positive points per play margin, a 0.002 points per play margin. You look at the data between these two teams, Washington is 66th. They're 66th in points per play margin. In ESPN's efficiency, Washington is 45th. Indiana is 4th in points per play margin with a 0.406 points per play margin. They are 5th in ESPN's efficiency, only behind Ohio State, who they actually beat out offensively. They just still lag behind Ohio State defensively, which is, well, very understandable. Even with some of the questions that, Buckeye fans and myself and others have about Ohio State's defense, it's still one of the better defenses in the country. I cannot say the same about Indiana's defense right now, even though they are putting up impressive numbers defensively, which is why their points per play margin is so large. They score 0.645 points per play, Indiana does, on offense. They only allow opponents to score 0.241 points per play on defense, which is 8th. And they only allow opponents to score 15.5 opponent points per game, which is 8th. And that's taking out their game against an FCS opponent where they held them to 3. So by scoring offense and defense, this is one of the most dominant teams in college football, and they're third in average scoring margin with an average scoring margin of plus 28.5. Whopping dominance. Awesome dominance from Indiana football. And to continue with that trend, Indiana is fourth in game control. They have the 109th best strength of schedule, I know, but they've been murdering everyone they've played. They've beaten everyone that they have played by multiple scores, just coming off of a massive win over Nebraska. Washington, meanwhile, is 57th in game control, 79th in strength of schedule. When healthy, because I know Curtis Rourke is out, this Ohio State team is slowly but surely, they're kind of reminding me of some of those older Ryan Day teams, like the 2021, 2022 Ryan Day teams, that high-flying offenses, brilliant play calling. This was before it was obvious Day had to give up play calling for the better of the program. Very aggressive, better on offense than defense, but you still have talent and good enough coaching on defense to where you're going to outscore people and you're going to beat them. In fact, I think they're better coached, Indiana is, than those teams are. They just don't have that same high ceiling level of talent everywhere. Like Curtis Rourke is no CJ Stroud. He's not. He's putting up really good numbers. He's an elite college quarterback, could be an NFL quarterback potentially if he keeps putting up these numbers against some of Indiana's better opponents. Maybe Indiana reaches the playoff and he does well there. But I think you get the point. This is an awesome team, even when you factor in strength of schedule. Washington hasn't played that much tougher of a strength of schedule, and they already have 3 losses. So there's a clear difference between these two teams. Nonetheless, Jed Fish is a good coach. Washington's coming off of a bye, and I think there is an argument after I've watched Washington play, especially in recent memory, compared to how Nebraska's played, and Washington, I don't know if they're better than Nebraska, but they may fare better against Indiana because Washington has a better offense than the Huskers do. And if you're going to beat Indiana, unless you have a generational defense or an elite defense, maybe we don't have to go quite to the extreme of generational. If you don't have that, you're going to have to outscore Indiana to beat them. You're going to have to engage in a little bit of a shootout, a little bit of back and forth action, and I feel like Washington is more comfortable doing that with their quarterback, their rushing attack, than Nebraska is. Nebraska has been bad on the ground all season long, but Washington has actually had some highlights running the football, and I think that's the key matchup in this game, is Washington's rushing offense against Indiana's defense. Because I think that even with Taven Jackson at quarterback, who did well against Nebraska, I do think the Hoosiers are going to move the football. They're going to score. It's the same thing I said about Penn State in the Penn State-Wisconsin preview and prediction video. Penn State's offense is guaranteed in probably every game, no matter who they play against this year, to score upper 20s, lower 30s, maybe mid-20s at the very lowest. For Indiana, it's probably the same thing, except since they're more efficient than Penn State by opponent-adjusted numbers, it's probably guaranteed to be low 20s at the absolute worst, low 30s, mid 30s, with maybe a rare exception because they're not as talented as a lot of the teams that are in their league relative to efficiency. But Washington, with Jonah Coleman, and then with their offensive line, Asione Falosu, guard Mimilar, D'Angelo Tatiali, Enoch Vimahi, and Drew Azzopardi, what do they do against an Indiana front that has James Carpenter, Marcus Burris Jr., Linnell Carr Jr., Mikael Kamara, CJ West, Tyreek Tucker, Andrew Turvey, and Vincent Sneed Jr.? How do those groups match up? And also, you got to look at the linebackers if Washington gets to the second level, or if Jonah Coleman gets in space where he's really good. Jalen Walker, Aiden Fisher, Amari Farrell, D'Angelo Pons, Josh Sanguinetti, Sean Asbury II, who had that awesome interception against Nebraska, and Jameer Johnson. This is an Indiana defense that, as I documented earlier, they are holding people to very low numbers, but efficiency metrics are a little bit concerned about that defense. Not in the sense that it's bad. In fact, I think being outside the top 50 in ESPN's efficiency metrics is kind of lame. I think that's underrating their defense a bit, but I don't think they're a top 10 defense like opponent points per game, opponent yards per point, opponent points per play, red zone scoring attempts, red zone scores, and offensive touchdowns per game and offensive points per game suggest. They're top 10 in all of those categories except offensive touchdowns allowed per game, which they're 11th. And you look at total defense for Indiana, they allow opponents to average 4.4 yards per play, which is about the same as Washington's. And they're also similar in opponent yards per game. Washington only allows 268.5 yards per game. Indiana allows 286.2. Neither have faced competent offenses, if I'm being honest. Washington, the best offense Washington has probably faced is Washington State or maybe Iowa. And we know that those are not good offenses. They're average at best. Well, I don't know about Washington State. I don't want to speak with an uneducated mind. I don't know about Washington State. I know that Washington State has the best quarterback that Washington has played all season long in John Mateer. Offensively overall, though, I don't know, but a quick Google search from you guys or myself after this video can probably figure that out. As for Indiana, the best offense they have played all season long, gee, let me think. Not FIU, not Charlotte, not Western Illinois, not North. It's probably Maryland. Maryland is probably the best offense that Indiana has played all season long. And Maryland's offense, while it has some talent, it's just, it's again, not a great offense, not an elite offense, not even close. So I'm curious to see what happens with both of these defenses. There's a chance that the total in this game could be maybe like 70 points. Don't believe me on that. The total was above 60 with Indiana versus Nebraska because the 56-7 final score. And Washington has a better offense than Nebraska does. Quick thing before I go, I wanted to look back at the defenses for these teams. Indiana allows opponents to average 0.241 opponent points per play, which is 8th. Washington allows opponents to average 0.319 opponent points per play. So they're top 10 in yards per play, plays per game, yards per game. They actually lead Indiana in all those categories I mentioned, but when it comes to scoring defense, Indiana's better than Washington in basically every category except for opponent red zone scoring percentage, where Indiana just slightly loses out to Washington there. And let's look at Washington's rushing offense before getting on to previewing these offenses. Washington's averaging 4.8 yards per carry right now, which is 40th, 153.2 rushing yards per game, which is 64th. They rarely run the football as well. They only average 31.8 attempts per game on the ground, which is 103rd. So I think that using Jonah Coleman in this game, who was 681 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, and is averaging 6.9 yards per carry, using him more and Cameron Davis and maybe tilting a little bit away from Will Rogers might be the wise move to shorten the game and limit possessions and control things a bit more. At the same time, though, Denzel Boston and Giles Jackson are really good, and Will Rogers has hit a next level this year compared to who he was at Mississippi State. So I think Washington has multiple angles they can attack Indiana on. Indiana, of course, is the favorite here. In fact, power ratings say they should be a bigger favorite than they are. I think a lot of that is due to the Curtis Rourke injury and Vegas accounting for that. But Washington will have to play a better game than I've seen them play all year to beat this Indiana team. And trust me, Taven Jackson is a good quarterback. They have a good quarterback room, Indiana does. There is not, in my opinion, much of a drop-off from Curtis Rourke to Taven Jackson. There is some, and that will especially hurt, I think, in a game like Ohio State. It could hurt in a game like this, maybe against Michigan, maybe against Purdue or Michigan State or Michigan, like the final 5 games, but more likely than not, you're really going to see it against Ohio State. I don't know about anyone else. I don't. And you may not even see it against Ohio State because maybe Rourke is back by then, or Jackson is, well, by then the starter, and he's really good. I would take Taven Jackson, actually, over Will Rogers. Will Rogers is 1,820 passing yards on the year, 13 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, a 162.6 passer rating. He's completing 72.2% of his passes and averaging 8.6 yards per pass attempt. He has a 66.3 quarterback efficiency rating, which is 47th. His best game of the year against a Power 4 opponent was Michigan in QBR, where he had an 84.5 QBR. The one interception he threw to Ernest Hausman was really a better play by Hausman than it was a poor play by Rodgers. Rodgers has had a better season so far this year than he has ever had before at Mississippi State in terms of passer rating, in terms of QBR, in terms of limiting the amount of interceptions that he's thrown. And his offensive line has not done the best job of protecting him. I wouldn't even say a great job, but it's not like the worst pass blocking offensive line in the Big Ten. And it's, I would say, an average offensive line. And you see that in the fact that they're actually running the football all right, around 5 yards per carry. I think that Will Rogers is good, and me saying that Taven Jackson, I believe, is actually better is more so a credit to Mike Shanahan and Kurt Cignetti and the job that they've done. Jackson this season is 12 of 18 in pass attempts, completing 66.7% of his throws, 225 passing touchdowns, 225 passing yards, not passing touchdowns. That would be like a record even for a sixth-year senior's career. 3 touchdown passes, no interceptions, a 226.7 passer rating. He has a 93.9 QBR. Perfect QBR basically against Nebraska and against Western Illinois. Did not have a good game, though, against Charlotte, but he only had 7 passing attempts in that game. So I'm curious to see his performance in this game, what Indiana does against Washington on the offensive side of the ball, because Rourke has 1,941 passing yards, 15 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, averaging 10.7 yards per pass attempt. He's been a very good quarterback this season, and I imagine that he will heal up soon, hopefully be back sometime in November, because after this game, the Indiana Hoosiers, after this college football weekend, it is November. They then travel to Michigan State November 2nd, host Michigan November 9th. They get a bye before traveling to Ohio State, which I know, all of you know, that's a game that Indiana has circled. It just is. So what'll happen here offensively without Curtis Rourke? I think Indiana will still find success in this matchup. As for Washington, I would take them at tight end over Indiana. And outside of running back, which I think is a push, I would take Indiana everywhere else. The offensive line, wide receiver, quarterback. Let's look at these rooms here. Washington, their leading rusher, we already talked about Jonah Coleman. Backup, Cameron Davis. Quarterback, DeMond Williams Jr. And another running back, Adam Muhammad, each have over 100 rushing yards and are averaging 4 yards per carry or more. For Indiana, their leading rusher on the season is Justice Ellison with 514 rushing yards. He's averaging 7 yards per carry. He has 8 rushing touchdowns. Backup Tyson Lawton's averaging 5.2 yards per carry on 393 rushing yards, and he also has 8 rushing touchdowns. Indiana is averaging 5.3 yards per carry. They have 1,417 rushing yards and 28 rushing touchdowns. Washington has 1,107 rushing yards. They're averaging 4.9 yards per carry. They only have 5 rushing touchdowns. That right there should show you not only who has the better rushing offense and who has the better offense overall, but who's having a plethora more success in the red zone. Washington has attempted 17 field goals this year with kicker Grady Gross, only made 10 of them, hasn't made a single kick from 50. You look from 30 yards on out, Grady Gross is 5 of 11 from field goals that are 30 yards or longer. As for Indiana, they've only attempted 4 field goals all season long. Nicholas Radicic, he hasn't made a field goal yet this season from beyond 37 yards. That's his long, but Joel Klatt and Gus Johnson said that in warmups against Nebraska, it looks like he can hit one in the 40s, maybe low 50s. Indiana has had pretty good special teams this year. At the same time, they haven't had to use them all that much. It's just, to me, it's clear that Indiana has the better offense here. At wide receiver, I sided with Indiana because I think they have better depth. Washington could easily have the best receiver out of all of them in Denzel Boston, who has 9 receiving touchdowns, 540 receiving yards. Giles Jackson has 542 and 2 receiving touchdowns. For Indiana, though, watching Elijah Surratt make the catches that he did, a huge part of that is Curtis Rourke and the quarterback he is. 578 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. Omar Cooper Jr. has 411 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. Miles Price and Miles Cross at least have a receiving touchdown and 200 or more receiving yards. Keyshawn Williams has 4 receiving touchdowns and 182 receiving yards. I just think that Indiana has better depth at receiver, while having a player in Elijah Surratt who's comparable to Denzel Boston or Giles Jackson in terms of talent and upside. And if talent and upside are pretty close, even if one team has more talent, you'd prefer the team that has maybe slightly less upside with their wide receiver. Well, I don't even know. Maybe slightly less upside in their top 2 wide receivers, but then you look at like the 5 or 6 best wide receivers, and this team has way more depth than this team does. I think that's why I picked the Hoosiers to have the better wide receiver room in this game, and I think they've had better success with the passing offense on the season. And Rourke has done better than Rodgers has, but again, Rodgers has had a pretty solid year so far. Solid is actually being unfair. He's had a pretty good season this far. And as for the offensive lines, Indiana has done a pretty good job of getting to the second level in run blocking. They've only allowed Rourke to be sacked 6 times. They've only allowed 7 sacks on the season. Washington, they have allowed 15 sacks total on the season, nearly double, and they haven't played that tougher of a strength of schedule or that much tougher defenses. I mean, Nebraska and Michigan have similar caliber defenses, and I think those are the toughest defenses that either of these teams have played, outside of maybe Washington playing Iowa. I actually think that Iowa's a better defense than Michigan, but Michigan's is more talented and has a better pass rush than what Iowa has. So looking at these offensive lines, Nebraska, Iowa, and Michigan, their defenses have all... Iowa's and Michigan's have definitely regressed from last year. I think Nebraska's may have even been a paper tiger from last year defensively, and it's only been exposed this season. You can compare those defenses. Indiana did a much better job against Nebraska's defense than Washington did against Michigan's defense or Iowa's defense. And speaking of defense, I think Indiana's better everywhere on the defensive side of the ball. I do think they have a better defense than the Huskies do. You look at sacks. Washington has earned 14 sacks on the season, 4 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, 2 passes defended. They have 31 passes defended. You look at Indiana. The Hoosiers have 21 passes defended, 21 sacks, 7 interceptions, 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries. Indiana has done a better job at forcing turnovers. They lead the Washington Huskies in fumbles per game, fumbles lost per game, slightly lead them in giveaways per game. They have about a half more turnovers per game in terms of turnover margin. Indiana's turnover margin per game is plus 0.7, which is 22nd. Washington's is only plus 0.2, which is 57th. Indiana earns about a 10th more of an interception per game compared to Washington. And both Indiana and Washington have played FCS opponents, so their games against FCS teams are counted out in the statistics that I just read aloud to you from teamrankings.com. But I think Indiana, I think they have a better defense. I don't think it's that much better. I don't think that Indiana at any position outside of maybe the defensive line has a pretty strict edge over Washington. But it's the fact that at every position they're slightly better, and they're more effective at preventing their opponents from scoring points than Washington is. And the whole purpose of defense and offense is to stop your opponent from scoring points and score points on your opponent respectively. So I do think that this Hoosier defense is better than the Husky defense. But since both have played a pretty light schedule, I could be wrong on that front. I could be wrong on, I think, a lot of things with both of these teams, except for the fact that I think Indiana is a better team. I think if Indiana loses this game, The narrative, unless Washington pulls off some more upsets and Indiana collapses, will be that this was just a weird game that went Washington's way due to Curtis Rourke being injured or some type of matchup edge that Washington had here. I look at, again, I mentioned Indiana's defense already, but players like James Carpenter, Marcus Burris Jr., Linnell Carr Jr., and Mikael Kamara, and then at linebacker, Jalen Walker, Aiden Fisher, Amari Farrell at Rover. How do they do against Jonah Coleman and this offensive line? And then how do D'Angelo Pons, Josh Sanguinetti, Sean Asbury II, the linebackers, and also Jameer Johnson, how do they do in pass coverage against a Washington passing offense that has a very high upside? Remember, Denzel Boston was developed along with Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, Rome Odunze, from the legendary wide receivers coach named Jamarcus Shepard, who's at Alabama right now. He was developed by Shepard, and he's playing like a Jamarcus Shepard wide receiver would be expected to play. Similarly with Giles Jackson, they're both having incredible seasons. How does Indiana's defense do against that offense? And as for Washington, how does Washington's defense, how do Isaiah Ward, Jacob Bandis, Sebastian Valadez, Voy Tanufi, Alfonso Tuputala, Carson Bruner, those two linebackers played significant snaps on last year's team. Same with strong safety Cameron Fabukulanen. And then how do Ephesians Prysock, Cameron Broussard, Thaddeus Dixon, and Jordan Shaw, other players in the secondary along with Fabukulanen, how do they do against an Indiana offense that no one has been able to stop all season long? How? Can they even stop this offense? I guess we're going to have to figure out on Saturday. In the trenches, I would favor Indiana over Washington. I think they have the better defensive line and the better offensive line. No additional comment on that. And I do think Indiana is better at special teams. I think they have the more accurate kicker. I think that they have the better punter. I think they're just better overall on special teams compared to the Huskies. And as for coaching, on the offensive side of the ball, I think it's a push because Jed Fish and Brennan Carroll are geniuses offensively, great schemers, game planners, play callers. At the same time, Mike Shanahan has done a very good job, an incredible job offensively with this team. Same with head coach Curt Cignetti, who was an elite recruiter and identifier of talent all the way back at Alabama, where he was Nick Saban's wide receivers coach from 2007 to 2010. Remember, the Saban coaching tree is not dead, not only because of Steve Sarkisian or Kirby Smart. You also got to include Dan Lanning, although I would more so put him in the Kirby Smart coaching tree. Curt Cignetti is a part of the Nick Saban coaching tree. So, yeah, the legacy of Saban, the greatest of all time, is going to be here for a while, and that's going to be awesome. I think Indiana is better at everything coaching staff-wise outside of the offense, which is a push. I think Indiana is better conditioned. I think they have the better defensive staff, and I think they have the better head coach. I think that Cignetti right now, with what I expect Indiana to do for the rest of the season, I do think Cignetti will enter next year certainly as a top 15 head coach, top 20. Maybe if they win a playoff game or something, if they make the playoff, of course, but if they reach the playoff, win a game or two, could even be unanimously rated or viewed as a top 10 head coach, which sounds crazy to say, but it only took Kalen DeBoer a few years to be viewed as a top 10, top 5 coach by many, and Washington fans know that. And he was a very good coach for them, Kalen DeBoer was, coming from also, like Cignetti, smaller and humbler beginnings at lower-level coaching jobs. I'm ultimately picking Indiana to win and cover here, and I think it's going to be another blowout. I get the short spread. It's because, number one, people can't handle Indiana being this good, because they don't fulfill the blue chip ratio by Bud Elliott. They don't fulfill team talent composite ratings. They don't have a ton of 4 stars or 5 stars. So it's just mind-boggling to think that they can be this good. Well, there are exceptions to the rule. I mean, think of 2022 Tennessee. They didn't fulfill the blue chip ratio. And Indiana is kind of like that team in a variety of ways, where they're just electric offensively, very hard to stop. Defensively, they have some questions, but they're good enough there to be a dominant team and one of the best teams in the country overall. And there are other examples. Think of Washington last year, where they weren't as dominant as this Indiana team, but they showed up in big games. They won a bunch of close games, and when they turned it on, they were revving the engine, and they were murdering defenses at will. So I do think Indiana is this good. I think it will take some time for people to adjust to that. It took time for me to adjust to it. I thought that Indiana was kind of fake throughout the month of September, and then the way they beat Maryland, where they turned it over 4 times and at one point led by 21 points, made me think this is a good team. When you can lose the turnover battle like that and still dominate your opponent, that's indicative of a good team. And then, they handled Northwestern, and then you get all the way here, and they beat down on Nebraska. And they also dominated UCLA. Don't forget about that either. So they haven't played a tough strength of schedule yet. But Michigan didn't last year. Michigan didn't the year before that. Up to this point in the season, I think Michigan, up until this point in the 2021 season, hadn't even played Michigan State yet. So there have been 3 Big Ten champions in the previous 3 years. And then you can say the same thing about, I'd say, not Ohio State last year because they played Notre Dame, but there have been some seasons where Ohio State's had an easy schedule to start things off, like this year, for example, before they played Oregon. And it's clear that Ohio State's a top 10 team based on how dominant they are. Indiana's very dominant. So you have to take that into account, and I think it's going to show up here. They'll win 45-14. I think Washington will make this interesting early on for maybe a quarter, but ultimately Indiana's going to keep scoring touchdowns. And I think Washington at some point is going to have to completely abandon field goals, get very aggressive, and they're not comfortable being that aggressive. They're not successful in being that aggressive and trying to do more than they can do and score more touchdowns than they've shown they're capable of scoring. So Indiana wins, and they cover the 6.5 point spread. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Conor OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the links in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all soon. Go Hoosiers, and go Huskies.